I saw Celia again, yes, for a second time, and it was only because of Anna. Yes, it always goes back to Anna, doesn't it? The new museum was holding a major retrospective of Anna Mendietta's work in the winter of 1987. Anna's first in the world, 2 years after she had died, after she had fallen 34 stories in the West Village, or was thrown. I'd never imagined that I'd ever have the opportunity to see so many of Anna's works in one space. There were more than 150. I assumed that I'd never have the chance again, so even though I could not afford it, I purchased a student membership with my very much expired student ID, and I went to the museum nearly every day until the exhibition closed. It is a wonderful thing to realize that there is so much more to learn about an artist you love. I was already familiar with much of Mendietta's work, though only through photographs, because nearly all of her work was ephemeral land art that eroded or washed away before many people in New York had ever heard of her. At this show, however, there was so much more. Even permanent sculptures. It was like realizing a very good book hadn't truly ended. There were many new chapters to read. So I spent a great deal of time walking the galleries, studying these pieces. But I was not the only one. I saw Celia that first week. She was studiously exploring Mendietta's Tree of Life. But I did not say anything. It had been 2 years since we sat next to each other at Anna's public memorial, so I wasn't sure it was her, and even if it was, I thought it might be strange to admit that I recognized her after so much time, especially since her long auburn hair had been sheared close to her scalp, making her appear maybe more boyish since I last saw her. Then I saw her again, days later, clunking around in brown leather workman's boots from one gallery to another, and then days later again, and then days later again, and by then I knew it had to be this girl who sat beside me at Anna's memorial. We were each looking at Anna's wooden sculptures, each of them carved like totems that stood upright. And Celia said, "You were at the funeral." No hello, no introduction, just this declarative. I told her I was, maybe a little surprised that one of us spoke at last. And we introduced ourselves, finally, formally. She said she would have introduced herself 2 years earlier, but after the 3-hour-long memorial, she couldn't muster the strength to speak to anyone. She said she'd become an artist solely because of Anna and her work, so she was devastated by Anna's fall, or by how Anna's artist husband threw her off the 34th floor. Though in 1987, a courtroom was still weeks from making a verdict on that. Celia apologized for not introducing herself 2 years earlier. And I asked, "Why are you apologizing? There's no need." We walked through the exhibition, catching up. Not catching up, I suppose, because we had never known one another. Getting acquainted was more like it. Though, as we spoke about Anna, it felt something like catching up, as if we had this mutual friend who, for whatever reason, was unable to join us in person that day. She asked me if I knew Anna. Truthfully, I only knew of her work. We were both in a group show once, but we didn't really have a chance to get to know each other. And then she asked, "You got to meet her, though?" Yes. She was a beautiful human being, but I only met her that one time. "You're lucky," she said. I never got to meet her. I only got to see some of these right after she made them. Like these. She pointed at a series of photos documenting Anna's muddy land art that had long washed away beside a creek. I was amazed. I asked, "You have seen this in person?" And she said, "I saw a lot of these in person, where she made them, in Iowa." I couldn't believe it. I had never met anyone who had actually ever seen any of Anna's ephemeral works outside of photographs. So I said, "Celia, then I believe you have met Anna." We were in our first show after graduating from Cooper Union. It was at this non-profit space in the Lower East Side. The usual kind of space, like exposed brick, rafters, before those kinds of things were considered cool. Some walls were crumbling. We spent a lot of time figuring out how to hang our shit without bricks falling on us. Nobody was allowed to use the toilet because the city had turned the water off. So you had to either go find a diner blocks away, or you took a shit in a bucket that these guys from Parsons left in the bathroom. Celia and I did not shit in the bucket, thank you very much. I might have peed in it, though. That show wouldn't bring in any of the blue chip gallerists, but maybe some of the B team would show up. The no-name gallerists who don't get reviewed in The Voice or Artforum or anywhere, really. Just somebody who could maybe, just maybe, in a 1 in a million chance go on to show our work in some middling gallery. And then maybe it'd be seen by somebody who once met some blue-chip gallerist's mistress's nephew's art history tutor. And they might mention up through that impossible chain that they'd seen some hot shit. And maybe someone from the good gallery should come down to the no-name gallery. But we didn't bank on that. We couldn't even bank on a toilet. We were nervous before the opening. Celia and I hadn't really sold anything serious yet. Not to anyone but friends and family. And we'd used up anyone who'd ever buy anything from us that way. That is a small market. Not that we did this to make money, but with how famous people like Jean and Keith had gotten, and how rich they'd gotten, money was on everyone's minds. It was probably 1 in the morning and the crowd thinned out. People were looking for an after party. Even Celia said it might be time to leave. And I'm like, "Celia, seriously, this might be my only opening. Let's just stay until the end." And then we look over at her photographs. She'd hung 2 sets, some shots from inside the A train and some others from a Russian bathhouse in Oceanside. This guy with long black hair and a cowboy shirt was looking at her photos really intensely. And Celia said, "Tribeca Darrell is looking at my photos." I looked closer, and sure enough, him. He grunted, "We've got a gorilla for sale here," in that airy drawl of his. He didn't even turn to look at us. Didn't know if he talked to us or himself. And Celia said, "Excuse me?" "A gorilla." He put his hands together and pointed his index fingers like a gun at the middle of the pics. And then he made a big imaginary box with them, stretching his arms out before completing the shape around his belt. I'm pretty sure it wasn't the shape of a gorilla. He finally turned to her and said, "It's about time." And he pointed at one of the subway pictures. He said, "It's about space." And he made air circles around the photos. "It's about strange people." He pointed out different models in each of the pictures. "In the strangest place." Celia said, "Oh yeah?" Obviously no idea what to make of this guy. He kept saying, "It has a refreshing new feeling. A refreshing new feeling. How many of these have you sold tonight?" 0, of course. Darrell still had his gallery in Tribeca, But now people were taking him more seriously. His artists were starting to be poached by the blue chip galleries. He said, "Tell me about this work," in that nasally drawl. "I want to know everything." Celia pointed at a model in the A-Train photo and more or less recited her artist statement, saying she wanted to show how a person changes the landscape around them simply by being present, without any need to dig up dirt or move boulders. He said, "I fucking love that. Do they love it at Cooper Union?" I said, "We did." And Celia looked at me like I was lying. Then she looked at him and she said, "Some people liked it. Not everyone sees what I'm doing." He moaned, Well, you know what Kung Fu-za said, right? Everything has its beauty, but not everyone sees it." We didn't know who Kung Fu-za was. Of course, the guy who goes by Tribeca Daryl used Confucius's proper name to try to impress people. On that first night, 15 of us piled into Daryl's gallery, and he told everyone to choose an easel. They were set up in a circle around this little platform thing. Then we got ready, putting up our sketch paper, picking out pencils, charcoal, or whatever the student's weapon of choice might be. And then Celia walked in. She wore a wool poncho, barefoot, nothing unusual for one of these gigs. Daryl introduced her, saying she hadn't modeled before. When you get the new ones, you try to make them comfortable. Don't ogle or nothing, right? When I tell my Con Ed buddies about these classes, they always ask, was she hot? Was she a looker? I tell them, guys, that's not the point. It's all business. Some of these models have been doing it for a while, get so relaxed they look like they're about to fall asleep. One guy at the Art Students League has a little problem fighting up the place after a while. Celia, though, she wasn't nervous like a lot of first-timers. Seemed like old hat to her. She dropped the poncho without missing a beat. Then she stepped onto the platform and we were off. It felt like a regular figure drawing class. The only difference, really, was the 6 cameras posted around us. They all had wires leading back to this podium thing that Daryl stood behind. You'd hit a button and all the cameras clicked at once. Click, 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 click. It was annoying, yeah, but I actually didn't even notice the cameras after Celia's first couple of poses. That first class went pretty well. Really well compared to everything else. A week after our opening, I was surprised to see Daryl sauntering around our apartment, pointing his paunch around like it sniffed out food. He came to see more of Celia's work. And he even looked like he'd put himself together a little bit better than usual. Like he actually visited on business. Maybe. He'd pulled his hair back into a ponytail, and for the only time in my life I saw him with his shirt tucked in. It was still a stupid cowboy shirt, but it was tucked in. And stupid or not, I noticed Celia noticing all of this too. He looked at one of her pieces and said, "Good night, Gracie." I walked in behind him, no idea who Gracie was. He looked at each set of her prints. He told her, "This reminds me of what Beuys said," and got really excited, more whiny than usual. "Do you dig Beuys?" "Beuys is all right," Celia said. I wasn't thinking about him, though. And he's all, "You know what he said, right? Every man is an artist. That's just theory, but your pictures make it law. I love these so much. You're proving conceptual art's main points like a goddamn scientist." She fucking smiled at him like he was the first dude who ever got what she was doing. He howled. Each. He stopped and pointed at the 3 models in 3 different pictures. Each of these people is an artist simply by being present. They are altering the landscape just by being there. Just like you told me last week. You know what else Beuys said, right? I said, Beuys has said a few things. Not even hearing me, he said, Beuys said, even the act of peeling a potato can be a work of art if it is a conscious act. Every one of these people is peeling their potato. Nobody was peeling a fucking potato. Not literally, metaphorically, whatever. He said, you're bringing the artist conscious to each of these people. You're waking us all up to what Beuys is saying. If we just think about how every man is an artist, we can finally see the art that each of us is making. I'm fucking flabbergasted here. How is no one showing your work yet? Oh, I know. I'm smarter than the average bear. I can see what no one else sees. This is 1988 right here. Fuck 1987. What am I thinking? Fuck 1988. This is the 90s. Right now. Yes, I'd agree that the first class went quite nicely. Miss Merode was a splendid model. Oh, I didn't mind the cameras, no. We were so focused on our work that the sporadic clicking flittered away like the sound of a songbird you no longer notice in the tree outside your window. And I did enjoy getting to know Mr. Darrell Stanton. He gave me a little peck on each cheek. Peck, peck. It was as if he'd brought me to the 7th arrondissement. The space, however, wasn't truly activated until the 2nd class. When Miss Merode dropped her wool poncho, I believe the students couldn't help but notice the cameras. She had a number of bruises on her body. Greenish-blue welts splotched her thigh. A larger one, fainter, splayed out from the left-hand side of her stomach. And then I heard the click. 6 of them at once, and then another click, and another. I turned to Mr. Stanton. He saw me looking at him, and he stopped clicking. He didn't start again until we were too focused on our work to notice him. We were out to dinner at Union Square Cafe. Darrell had invited me and this guy I was seeing to go out to eat with him and Celia. I'm pretty sure that Darrell never actually knew my name, though, even after they'd been a thing for a couple of months. Celia told me he said to invite that roommate of mine along, and she laughed at me. Maybe not at me, but it felt that way. At the table, he had his hands all over her. He'd have a hand on her thigh. He'd wrap his arm behind her back. He'd stop and kiss her beneath the ear. It was gross. He looked at my boyfriend and wailed, "Isn't Celia fucking gorgeous?" Darrell was not an attractive man. His nose was covered in blackheads. His eyes bulged like his head was in a vice. But every other sentence out of his mouth was some huge statement about how great Celia's art was, or how beautiful she was. I told her so many times, that man has you in a trance. You're eating that shit up. You'd never be with that guy if he didn't praise you every second of the day. If he didn't want to show your art. And that got her mad. She yelled, "What the fuck?" at me. I'm not shallow. I'm not this. I'm not that. And what's wrong with being appreciated for once? It was something to watch. Jealous of that situation? Are you kidding me? Look, I obviously wanted my work in a gallery. But not like that. No, that's not what I'm saying. It's just like, you've seen this guy, right? No? You won't talk to you? Yeah. What were we even talking about? Union Square Cafe? At the restaurant, Daryl said, "Have you seen her fucking work?" He practically screamed at this guy I was dating. I don't even remember the guy's name, maybe Ryan, but I remember Daryl just yelling at him across the table. I don't think Daryl said more than hello to me all night. He was just talking to Ryan. Not even talking to him, talking at him. He drawled, "You ever read about Boys and the Coyote? You were probably in diapers then. It was 74. He sat in a cage with a coyote for 3 days. In a gallery just a few blocks from here. Just him and his fucking coyote. While he's eye to eye with this wild animal for days. Just mano a mano. Mano a animo. Boys is thinking to himself, this coyote isn't from New York. This coyote's ancestors came here from across the Bering Strait. This coyote comes from wolf blood. Wolf blood. It came here to the United States of America and changed its whole being. The landscape changed it. And Boys is thinking, I should bring the coyote back to Asia and watch it become a wolf again." He kept saying, "I think it can go the other way. Celia's teaching me that with her pictures. It's not just the landscape that changes people. People change the land just by being introduced. No Michael Heiser plowing the land necessary. Celia's smarter than Boys, aren't you, sweetie?" He squeezed her thigh hard enough to make her jump in her seat. And then he started singing. "Daryl wants a gal who's dreamy. Daryl wants a gal who's creamy. Daryl wants a gal to call his own." Celia said, "Stop that." But she couldn't help laughing. I mean, I guess I couldn't either. I was horrified, but I still laughed. And he laughed super loud at himself. So loud that people 3 tables away stared. And then Celia said, "I want to do something like that, though." I asked her if she wanted to sit in a cage with a wolf. And she said, no, I want to do something performative. I want to make more of a performance out of my series so that I can more clearly capture the energy of the model. I think I want the audience to almost be involved. I'm thinking of Anna's rape scene where she had classmates go to her apartment to find her tied up to a table and covered in blood. Or Yoko Ono when she did cut piece and invited audience members to cut pieces of her clothes off on stage. Or maybe Marina Abramovic when she let the audience do whatever they wanted to her for 6 hours. She almost got shot. I don't want to do anything that drastic. I don't think it's necessary, but I want to activate the landscape more than I already am. I think that what I'm doing is it's getting too lost in theory. And most people can't see what I'm seeing. Daryl said, "Fuck 'em, babe." And she's like, "Sure, but I think it would be interesting to get a more definitive reaction from the model's presence." When Celia walked in on that third night, she didn't even need to drop the shawl. We could already see all the new bruises she had on her legs and on her arms, and she had that horrific black eye. And I was going to say hello to her, but I stopped myself when I saw that. There was a very audible, like, I think I gasped. I couldn't help myself. She was just like covered in all of these bruises, like green, blue, purple, black, like somebody had just like beaten her into a leopard of bruises, but they were almost like too perfect in a way. Like I couldn't tell if they were real or not. I turned to Daryl to see if he had anything to say about it, but he didn't say a word. I just heard the cameras clicking. I counted 34 bruises in all. In one of my drawings, I didn't even show her limbs or her body or even an outline. I just did the 34 bruises, and even with just those, I think you could tell it was Celia. You just needed to connect all of the bruises.
The three of us, Celia, Daryl, and me, we were drinking Budweisers at his place, this tiny apartment near Washington Square that had a shower in the kitchen. We were talking a lot about how Celia might do this figure modeling piece. Just chilling out before we'd go out for the night. We were planning to walk across the village to catch this show at cbgb. And then Daryl yipped at her. "You're gonna be the model, right?" Celia shook her head and sipped from her can on a couch. She said, "I'll probably ask one of my usual models." He whined, "No, no, no," and sat down next to her all lovey-dovey gross. He ran his finger up and down her arm. "It's gotta be you. It's gotta be you. You'd be perfect." Then she said, "I'd really rather not. I like what Cindy Sherman says about it." Then he said, "And what does that sellout bitch say about it?" She put her beer down and said, "Okay, 1, I don't think she's a sellout, and 2, don't call her a fucking bitch." He said, "I said sellout bitch, not fucking bitch." Seriously. And she kept talking, saying, "And 3, she doesn't like to be naked in any of her photos because it would distract the audience from what she's doing." He stood up and said, "She's just a fucking prude." He got all worked up and walked over to his cassettes. He thumbed through them like he needed a distraction. And then without looking at her, he said, "You're better than her, so much better." Celia seemed really upset. It wasn't really like her, though. She didn't have a response. She just glowered at him. I guess that's all he needed. He saw her face and immediately stopped thumbing through his tapes and rushed up to her and squeezed between her and the couch's purple arm. He lightly held onto her hand, but she pulled away. He said, "I'm sorry, babe. I'm sorry. Really, I am. I didn't mean to say those things about Cindy. I think about you, and I think it ought to be you who the collectors are going all gaga for, and I get so annoyed. I'm not annoyed at you. I'm not trying to fight you. I'm annoyed that people don't appreciate you the way that I appreciate you. It hurts me, babe. It fucks me up just knowing that you are making amazing work, and it feels like I'm the only one who knows it. I'm sorry, babe." She didn't look at him the entire time. She just stared straight ahead while he talked over the music. But she eventually turned and she had that look in her eyes like, "Okay, whatever. I won't be mad. I'll be mad until we get to cbgb, and then I'll forget what we fought about because the sound will be so fucking bad and we won't be able to hear a single thing but feedback coming off the stage, and I'll be annoyed about that instead." At least that's what I felt. We'd had a lot of camaraderie in those first couple of weeks. After the black eye and those other bruises, though, a few people didn't sit behind those easels no more. This guy who done these figure drawing classes for decades said this was the first time he'd ever felt voyeuristic about it. There was like an audible sound of relief when she walked in without any bruises on the fourth night. Her arms and legs actually didn't have any. She seemed fine.
I looked at the other students like, what's going on here? It's only been a week. Did she really heal up already? Her eye had been disgusting. But then she dropped a shawl. The bruises on her torso were still there. And I actually remembered where all of them were, 'cause I drew 'em so many times the week before. Don't tell anyone, but I saved a couple of those drawings. I'm still hoping to make some money off them, but I don't really know how. Maybe you could help me with that? No? Okay. But those bruises on her torso had been joined by, I don't know, all the other bruises from her arms and legs. Her chest, stomach, and back were just loaded with all these greenish-blue welts. It was like they all migrated toward her chest. I didn't think of her as naked that night. We might have been voyeurs, but there was nothing sexual about it. Definitely the opposite. No. We didn't make it to CBGB that night. We were walking down Waverly from Washington Square, pretty chilled out after Daryl was all lovey-dovey gross back at the apartment. I looked side to side and I realized it's just me and Daryl walking together. And I'm like, what the fuck? And I'm the first one to stop, of course. I don't think he even noticed that Celia didn't keep up with us. I just assumed one of her laces came untied. But I turn around and I see Celia standing there gawking up at the sky. I said, what's up, Cece? You look like a tourist. She didn't say anything. Celia? She looked at me and I thought she might cry. She said, that's it. And pointed up at the apartment building on Mercer and Waverly. It was taller than anything else around. It was out of place in the West Village. And I knew what she meant. And Daryl asked, what? Of course Daryl didn't know. A deli sign hummed above us. The building, Celia told us, where Anna was thrown off. I haven't walked by here since the trial started. I didn't hear much about Anna Mendieta for a while. But Celia started bringing her up again because the trial was in the papers. It was wild. The art world was up in arms about the case. The minimalists and everyone who loved him said Anna's minimalist husband was innocent. And the feminists were all saying that he threw her out the window. It was like two rival gangs, sharks and jets, minimalists and feminists. The two of them couldn't even talk to each other during the trial, or else they'd tear each other apart. Celia just kept standing there, staring up at the building like she couldn't believe how tall it was. She needed somebody to hug her. And I looked over at Daryl, and that fucking goon just stood there rolling his lips into his mouth like a moron. I smacked his arm with the back of my hand and motioned him to Celia, like, go to her. He kind of sauntered over to her, wrapped his arms around her. At first, I didn't know if she'd let him hug her. I thought she was going to pull away, and I felt bad because I just made things worse. But then she kind of went limp and fell into his arms. She rested her head on his shoulder. I might not have liked Daryl at all, but he somehow made Celia feel good. Then he mumbled, I'm sorry, babe. Are you taking the news hard? She still had her head on his shoulder. She whispered, what news? He said, oh, it's over. You knew that, right? What was over? She lifted her head and looked him in the eyes. He pulled away a little. The trial, he said. He said Anna's husband got off today. You didn't hear? She looked at me, obviously wondering if I knew anything about it. But the only paper I read was The Voice, so that day's news wouldn't be out for a week. I shrugged. Celia turned back to Daryl.
She said, "He got away with it?" He shook his head a little bit and said, "Well, hold on. I wouldn't say he got away with it. He didn't do it. He was acquitted." He didn't do it? She pushed herself off him. Then he tried putting his hands on her waist. And then she said, "No," and flicked his hands away from her. "What do you mean he didn't do it?" He said, "I mean he didn't throw her off. The jury acquitted him." She stared him down and said, "No. What do you mean he didn't do it? Are you going to believe some fucking jury?" He pointed up and said, "Celia, babe, I don't think he threw her out that window." "You really believe he didn't throw her off?" He stuttered, "Well, yeah, babe." And she shouted, "You fucking asshole!" and really let him have it. People walking by tried not to stare. And she said, "Have you been paying attention to this trial at all? She was afraid of heights. She was going to divorce him. She had plans for the future. Why would she jump out of a 34-story window?" Then that fucking goon put his hand on her mouth. She jolted backwards. She said, "What the fuck are you doing? Are you trying to keep me quiet?" And he's all, "Babe, babe, babe." She yelled, "How many times have I talked about Anna? How many fucking times have I told you that there is no way that she jumped out of that building? What the fuck were you thinking that whole time? What were you thinking of me? That I'm stupid?" And he's still all, "Babe, babe, babe." Then that fucker put his palm up against her mouth again. And she said, No. You're taking their side. You're afraid that you'll never be a big deal if you don't, aren't you? You're fucking pathetic, Daryl. Somebody got murdered and you won't admit it because you want to what? Represent Donald fucking Judd? You're pathetic. And you call other artists sellouts. I guess that riled him up. He fucking grabbed her by the arms. He shook her a little bit. I shouted, "What the fuck are you doing?" He twisted his neck and saw me ready to pounce on him. He looked like a scared little boy. He turned back to Celia, then back to me. She tried wriggling out of his hands, and he finally let her go. He yelled, "Whatever, fucking whatever!" And he stormed back up Waverly, the way that we came. Celia and I stood there for a while, shaking off whatever just happened. I said, "What an asshole," and looked over at her. I don't know why she didn't say the same thing. On the 5th night, she dropped the shawl, and someone was just like, "Oh, come on." No, I didn't know what to make of it. I don't think anyone did. There were these 2 guys in the class, and they just immediately, stood up, packed up their things, and left, one right after the other. One of them turned back to us and shouted something like, "This is ridiculous." We all saw it at the same time because it was on both her chest and on her back. It was the first time we all definitely knew it was just makeup. Yeah, Daryl began clicking as soon as she dropped the shawl. So maybe those first pictures captured our expressions just before we realized it was makeup. I think those are the pictures she used in the exhibition, from that very first moment of shock before we knew what was up. Because for a very brief moment, we thought Celia had 34 bruises in the shape of 2 crosses on her body. 17 bruises in the sign of the cross on her chest, and 17 more bruises making the same shape on her back. Those guys who left must have been religious or something. No, I didn't know what her point was, but most of us must have felt it was worth sticking around for. Everyone got to work behind their easels anyway.
So Celia did her 12-minute-long warm-up poses, and then she did her first 20-minute-long pose. She lifted both of her arms and held them up in a limp T, and her head drooped down so that her chin rested on her right collarbone. And then with her legs together and her feet overlapping each other, she lifted herself up onto her toes, making her body look like it just hung there. Almost like her toes didn't touch the ground at all. Like she could just fall at any moment. For the first time in weeks, I didn't notice the cameras clicking.
I wish I could say I was excited for a solo show. You're looking at me again like you want to ask if I was jealous. Yes, you are. And no, I was not jealous. I just never got over that night on Waverly. She did. Too fast, really. The day after their big blowout, she came back to our apartment and was psyched about the figure drawing series. She said she'd be the model. She said, "I'm excited. I am. It's giving me energy." Daryl had somehow rolled a Confucius quote into how Ana Mendieta did nude work. I definitely rolled my eyes when she said it made her feel better about it. Still, they started this project, and it did seem to go well. She was pumped up whenever she finished a class. So I was excited for her, actually. But that last night, she walked to the studio and she shut herself in Daryl's office in the back of the gallery. Like every week, she hung her shawl on a hook and took off all of her clothes. She stood there naked. She opened a giant purse full of makeup, and she was about to apply the first bruise when she heard a knock. It was Daryl, like she'd been expecting. He walked in. It was all business. It needed to be done fast before class. She'd do all the bruises that she could reach, and Daryl would do everything that she couldn't see. While she sorted through all the makeup on his desk, she stood in front of Daryl with her back to him. I don't even know what she planned to put on her body. She's never said. She just told me that she stood there, gabbing away, talking nonstop about whatever. Her back was to him. She talked about shows that she wanted to see. Keith Haring, Kiki Smith, and then she asked him what he planned to see that week.
That last night felt off, even more than the others. When she walked in, she seemed really upset. She hadn't been crying, no puffy eyes or anything, but she looked mad and maybe stunned. I kind of felt like a bomb sat beneath us, just waiting to go off. I looked over at Daryl to see if he picked up on any of this. But he was whatever, pretty chilled out, even though he looked like he had a black eye. Yeah, for a second I thought that he'd be the model that night. She's the one who dropped the shawl, though. No bruises. Well, not the 34 bruises that she'd obviously painted on anyway. She just had a couple of light bruises on both of her arms, up around the triceps. I didn't notice them so much at first, and I think they actually got darker by the end of class, if that's possible. At least I didn't notice them right away. I just noticed that for the first time, Celia did not want to be there. I was so preoccupied with this new attitude that It took me a while to finally see what everyone talked about after class.
He said, I'm probably gonna hit up Bloom-Hellman this week. And she said,
Bloom-Hellman? Who are they showing again?
He stopped what he was doing and said, oh, you know, Judd, Kelly, the big guns. And she asked, and? And he's all, and what? She told me she felt really tense. She turned around to face him. She asked, and who else has work in the show? She knew who had work in the show. He said, Hunt, disuvero, and... He said, babe, fine, come on, I get it. You know Anna's husband has some work in the show. What's the big deal? She said, why are you supporting him? And he's all, there are 4 other dudes in this show. But she asked, why are you supporting him? He didn't say anything. Why, she said, aren't you supporting me and how I feel about this? He moaned, I don't get it, Celia. You never even met her. And that made her say, fuck you, Daryl. I wouldn't even be an artist if it wasn't for Anna. He actually said, I don't think you can really say you're an artist yet. You haven't even had this solo show. And she punched him in the fucking eye. Hard enough to hurt her knuckles. He grabbed his face and moaned. She said, you don't get to tell me I'm not an artist. He held one eye and gawked at her with the other, like seriously stunned, and maybe like he was about to cry. He mumbled, oh, babe. She told me that he reached out to her face with his hands. He was going to cradle her chin or something, but she flung his hands away. And he's all, oh, babe, I'm sorry. Truly, babe. He grabbed her by the waist. He grabbed her before she could back away. And he pulled her in closer. And he kept saying, I'm so sorry, babe. He pressed her against himself. She tried pushing away, but he kept pulling her in. I'm sorry, babe. Come here. He had her in a really tight grip by both of her arms, just under her shoulders. She couldn't move, and he kept saying he was sorry. So for a second, she stopped fighting. But then he kissed her under her ear, and his lips moved across her face. She tried pressing her hands up against him, but he was still holding on to her too tight, squeezing her into a gap between the desk and the wall. She said, no, Daryl, I'm not doing this, Daryl. Then he kissed her mouth. She was completely naked in his arms. He undid his pants. She shoved back harder. She told him no. Over and over again. He pushed his pants down to his knees. He kept mumbling sorry. Sorry? I'm sure he was so sorry. She wanted to punch him off of her, punch him in the face until he couldn't talk or see. But she felt like she couldn't anymore. Not just physically, not just because she was trapped. She said she was very confused. She was pushing, and then she wasn't. He let go of her. But did she tell you what he did next? He started masturbating. I took the same flight to LaGuardia as her parents. Yeah, the semioticians from the University of Iowa. We were all very excited to see her first show. I knew she could get her own show, but to do it so quickly and with a good gallerist like Daryl Stanton, I had to explain to her parents that this was all really quite impressive. Though I was surprised to find what she'd hung in her exhibition. After her parents and I took her to a celebratory dinner, we all walked into the Stanton Gallery early, just before the opening officially began. The gallery was empty, aside from Celia and her parents and I. I prefer things that way. I'm just not interested in talking to anyone I used to know in the New York art world, but unfortunately, this was a rare instance where an old acquaintance might have been welcome. Celia, of course, stood naked in every photograph. I have no problem with nudity, usually, but I'd known her since she was little, and as we paced from one wall to the next, I do believe her parents tried very hard to not say anything about it. Her father said, "And this is open to the public?" Yeah, of course, Celia said. Why else would she ask you to fly here? We all laughed, knowing why he'd asked. On the first wall there was a single framed photograph blown up to 4 feet by 4 feet, large enough to make out the details of not only her, of course, standing nude on a platform, but of the many students' faces in the room. Only 1 or 2 students looked directly at her. The rest remained very focused on their work. It was a typical art school scene, nothing out of the ordinary, though I did like how the students' work was incorporated. Celia told us that every drawing the students did was scattered around the photograph. There must have been hundreds for each photo. I really did enjoy that. The drawings were haphazardly pinned to the wall or taped, and authors were allowed to fall right down to the floor. Even when we arrived, some of the drawings already lay scattered across the ground. It truly was interesting to see how each of these amateur artists saw her, or interpreted her. We moved on to the next wall. The photographs were black and white, so it wasn't terribly easy to tell. But at the next photograph, her mother asked, "What are these marks on your body?" And Celia happily explained, "Bruises." No explanation. So her mother asked, "Bruises?" Still, there was no explanation from Celia. She said, "I'll explain at the end." And we eagerly awaited this explanation, especially as the marks became much darker in the next photograph. The drawings scattered about the wall and floor really pronounced these bruises, and the Merodes seemed taken aback. They searched Celia's body when she wasn't looking, and I admit I looked as well. We didn't get our explanation, not at the opening. We walked into the second room of the gallery space, and I immediately noticed the photograph of her in the crucifixion pose. It reminded me of an image from Hannah Wilke's Super T art photos, or even a photo by Francesca Woodman where she hung naked by her fingertips from the frame of a doorway. But this isn't where Celia led us. Celia rushed up to another set in the series, perhaps the final images. She looked at this last photograph and literally roared, "What the fuck?" The gallery was becoming quite crowded. Guests sipped cheap champagne, a DJ played music, but Celia looked very unhappy. She spun around and yelled, "Daryl!" into the crowd. "Daryl!" Then we finally saw Daryl Stanton walking in between the partygoers. He smiled. He held his palms up to the set that Celia seemed to be so aghast by, as if to say, "Look at this, isn't this wonderful?" But she yelled, "Why are these up?" I walked closer to the photograph as well, knowing that something was obviously quite wrong. In that odd voice of his, he said something like, "Look, I know you said we weren't putting these ones up, but you can't just end the series with the cross. It's too heavy-handed. I like how this one looks like we're coming full circle. No bruises, just your clean skin." I wasn't sure why Celia didn't want the photograph in the series. It should have been her decision to include it, yeah, but she seemed too angry for it to only be that. In this last photograph, she appeared to be suppressing something. She wasn't exactly stoic like in the other photos, and something ran down her leg. I won't guess what, though. I assume you know something about that. The drawings scattered around the photograph conveyed all of that as well. Then Celia said, "I told you I was not including this set, and you went behind my back and hung it? When? Well, I stepped out for an hour with my parents?" And he said, "It completes the show, babe." Her parents looked stunned when she yelled, "Fuck you, Daryl!" But Daryl continued to say, "Besides, wouldn't it be nice if we could sell another set?" Celia again said, "Oh my god, fuck you, Daryl, fuck you." And he asked, "What's the deal, babe? Just chill out. Why are you getting so undone by this?" She threw up her hands and said, "Undone? Oh, I'm gonna be undone by it, you fuck." Celia and I had become very good friends since the Mendieta retrospective. After bumping into each other and finally speaking, we met every week at the new museum until the exhibition closed. I believe we both felt we could talk to each other about art without there being any expectation for anything else. When the conversations were about art, they were purely about art. It wasn't about competition with each other or wanting to screw like other artists. These were conversations, and I hadn't really had that with many other people before then. Still, I was surprised by what she asked me to do. I'd gone to the show at the Stanton Gallery, of course, but by the time I arrived, she wasn't there. I asked anyone who I recognized, and then I asked anyone I did not. Why isn't Celia at her opening? I was apparently so late that no one I asked had even seen her leave. So I took a very long and winding walk back to my apartment in the Lower East Side. By the time I returned home, my answering machine blinked red.
The first message was Celia. The second message was Celia. The third message was Celia. When I called her back, she told me to meet her at 3 a.m. Yes, of course. You know Celia well enough to know that isn't exactly the most outlandish request she could make. At the appointed time, we stood in Daryl's alleyway. Celia inserted the key he'd given her months before, and I looked up and down the alley, afraid, really, that somebody might see us, even if she did have a key. She opened the door and completely disappeared into a dark room. I followed her, but I could only take 3 or 4 steps. It was too dark to see. So I put up my hands, trying to feel my way forward, but I couldn't even see my fingers. I heard Celia searching for a light switch. Then I heard the hum of the bulbs igniting overhead, and I was blinded. I blinked twice, and then I saw the show that had opened only hours before. I noticed that half of the wall labels already had red dots on them. The pieces had sold. But Celia didn't appear to notice this. Instead, I heard paper crunching. Across the gallery, Celia opened a paper bag. She crumpled up one of the piece's student drawings. She started crumpling all of them up into balls and tossing them into the paper bag. She turned back to me and said, "Hurry, all of these." I rushed across the gallery as if I was being chased, and I started tearing down all of the drawings that were made for the final photograph. No, I didn't ask any questions. It was her work, and it was her command. I didn't know these figure drawing classes produced so much work. We tore from either edge of the wall, making our way to the center where the large photograph hung. It was the last piece in the series, where her skin was mostly clear once more. Though something that appeared to be cum streaked her thigh, I didn't ask her then, only later. Cum, she told me. Daryl's cum. She said she'd left it on herself for the class as a protest. A protest she wanted to later present on her own terms. But he'd taken that power back from her before she had the chance. We filled the paper bag, and then she pulled the frame off of the wall. It fell to the ground and shattered face down. I looked at her, wondering if she'd meant to do that. She was already on her knees, tearing the back of the frame off. She pulled the photo out of the frame, and that too was crumpled up and jammed into the paper bag. I had never run across Manhattan before. It is 2 miles wide. But we ran that night. We ran back to the Lower East Side. We saw a man hunched over a garbage can fire on the sidewalk. Yes, the city still had these fires then. Celia pointed at the can, startling the man. She said we should burn the paper bag and everything in it. Her first show made a wonderful flame.